I always believed I'd know the moment my marriage started to end. I imagined it would announce itself, a slammed door, a raised voice, some unmistakable rupture I could point to later and say, "There, that was it." Instead, it arrived quietly, the way most real betrayals do, in the calendar notifications I wasn't meant to see, in a name that started appearing at the bottom of Marcus's emails more often than mine did, in the particular way he'd started angling his phone away from me at dinner, just slightly, just enough. Her name was Sydney, 26, sharp, endlessly capable, the assistant Marcus had hired 8 months earlier to help him manage the expansion of his firm, back when I still believed help him manage meant exactly that, and nothing more. I noticed the late nights first, then the trips that required just her, since she already had the client relationships. Then, one evening in March, I picked up his phone to check the time and saw a message preview I wasn't supposed to see, and understood, in the space of 4 words, that I had been quietly erased from my own marriage for months, without ever being told. I didn't confront him, not that night, not the next week. I have never been a woman who moves before she's certain, and I intended to become entirely certain before I moved at all. What Marcus didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had spent 11 years building the very systems that ran his business. I understood exactly where the money went, and exactly how quickly a life like his could unravel once someone who actually knew the architecture decided to stop protecting it. My name is Renata Cole, and for 11 years I was the quiet architecture behind everything Marcus built. We met in graduate school, both of us broke and ambitious in the particular way people are before life has had the chance to disappoint them. He wanted to start a firm. I had the numbers mind, he didn't. The patience for spreadsheets, contracts, the slow, unglamorous work of making a business actually survive its first 5 years. We married young, poor, and certain of each other, and for a long time that certainty was enough. I built the financial systems for his firm before it had a name. I negotiated the first office lease. I sat up nights teaching myself compliance law so we wouldn't need to pay someone else to do it. Marcus was the face of the company, charming, persuasive, the one clients remembered from meetings. I was the reason there was still a company for them to remember him from. I never minded the arrangement. I liked the quiet of it, the sense of being essential without needing to be seen. It was only in the last year, watching Sydney's name migrate from the bottom of his emails to the center of his calendar, that I began to understand how easily quiet could tip into invisible, and how thin that line had always been. The late nights started reasonably, the way these things always do. An expansion into 2 new markets. A workload too large for Marcus to manage alone. Sydney had been hired to handle logistics, and logistics, apparently, required an enormous amount of trust. Trust that used to be extended to me, before I'd quietly become someone Marcus updated, rather than someone Marcus consulted. I told myself I didn't mind that either. I had plenty to occupy me. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching your own marriage get restructured around you, one reasonable-sounding meeting at a time, and I felt it settle into my chest sometime in February, though I didn't yet have proof of anything beyond a feeling. The message I saw in March changed that. Marcus had left his phone face up on the kitchen counter while he showered, something he rarely did anymore, and when it lit up with a preview I wasn't trying to see, I read 4 words that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my life. Can't stop thinking about. The rest was cut off by the lock screen. I didn't need the rest. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the way you stand very still after stepping on something sharp, waiting to see how badly you're hurt before you move. Then I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it, screen down, and went upstairs to finish getting ready for a dinner reservation I no longer had any interest in keeping. That night, across the table from him, I watched Marcus laugh at his own joke, refill my wine without asking if I wanted more, mention offhand that Sydney had really been a lifesaver on the Denver account, and I said nothing. I smiled. I asked follow-up questions about the Denver account, actually, because some old professional instinct in me wanted to know exactly how deep this had gone, structurally, before I let myself feel anything about it emotionally. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay beside a man I had built a decade of Tuesdays with, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, and I made myself a promise instead of a scene. I would not confront him until I understood everything. Not just the affair. I could feel, already, that it was more than an affair, but the shape of what he and Sydney might actually be building, and what it might be costing me without my knowledge or consent. The next morning, while Marcus was in a meeting, I opened the firm's accounting software using credentials that were still, after 11 years, registered under my name. I hadn't looked closely at the books in nearly 2 years. Marcus had gently, gradually taken that over too, telling me I should focus on the things I actually enjoyed. Once the firm could afford a bookkeeper, I'd let him. I'd trusted him. What I found in the first 20 minutes of looking told me that trust had been a mistake with a dollar amount attached, and that Sydney's name appeared in places far more troubling than his phone. The first irregularity was small enough that I almost dismissed it: a consulting fee, paid monthly to an entity called Vance Strategic Partners, that I didn't recognize from any vendor meeting I'd ever sat in on. $11,000 a month, going out steadily since the previous June, filed under business development. I searched the entity name and found almost nothing: no website, a registration filed in a neighboring state, listing a registered agent service instead of an actual person. The kind of shell that exists for exactly one purpose: to make money disappear somewhere quiet. I spent the better part of that week doing what I used to do best: reading the numbers the way other people read faces, looking for the small tell that gives everything away. I cross-referenced bank statements against client contracts, matched dates against Marcus's travel calendar, and slowly, carefully, built a picture I wished I hadn't. Vance Strategic Partners had been registered 4 months before Sydney was hired. The registered agent's address, when I finally traced it through a business filing database, connected to a P.O. box that matched an address on an old apartment lease, Sydney's apartment lease, from before she'd moved into the building 2 blocks from our firm's office, the one Marcus had mentioned once, in passing, as convenient for her commute. I sat with that for a long time. This wasn't simply a man falling for someone younger, someone new, someone who laughed at his jokes with more enthusiasm than a decade of marriage generally allows. This was calculated. Someone had set up a shell company before Sydney was ever formally hired, and $11,000 a month had been flowing out of our firm and into it for the better part of a year. I didn't know yet whether Marcus understood the full shape of what he'd built, or whether he was, in some ways, being used as thoroughly as I was. Both possibilities unsettled me for different reasons. That Friday, our firm held its quarterly dinner, a tradition I'd started years earlier, back when the whole staff could fit around 2 pushed-together tables at the Italian place on 5th. It had grown since then, the way the firm had grown, into a private room at a hotel downtown with 40 people and a seating chart Marcus's office handled without consulting me. I found myself seated 3 chairs from him. Sydney sat at his right hand. I watched them across the noise of the room, the easy way she leaned toward him when she spoke, the way his hand found the back of her chair when he stood to make his toast to another record quarter, thanks to the incredible team in this room. I watched 40 employees raise their glasses to a man who had, as far as I could tell, been quietly bleeding the company he was toasting to. After the toast, Sydney caught my eye across the table and smiled. Warm, easy, entirely unbothered, and said, loudly enough for the people near us to hear, "Renata, I don't know how you've put up with how much Marcus works. You must be a saint." Something in her tone made it clear she thought she was being kind. Something in her eyes made it clear she wasn't entirely sure. "I've learned to occupy myself," I said, and smiled back, and watched her relax slightly, satisfied that the wife across the table was exactly as harmless and unaware as she'd assumed. I let her believe that. I had gotten good, over the past month, at letting people believe things that weren't true. It was, after all, the exact skill Marcus and Sydney had been relying on the whole time. Later that night, back home, Marcus fell asleep almost immediately, worn out from a night of being celebrated for numbers he hadn't actually produced. I lay awake beside him with my laptop propped on my knees, going through Vance Strategic Partners' filing history one more time, and found something I'd missed on the first pass. A second registered entity, filed under a nearly identical name, 3 weeks earlier. Vance Strategic Partners 2, a new one, freshly opened. Already, in the 3 weeks since its filing, receiving its first transfer, Not $11,000 this time, but $42,000, moved out of the firm's expansion fund on a Tuesday I remembered clearly, because it was the same day Marcus had told me he'd be in Denver for a client meeting that, according to the firm's own travel records, had never actually been booked. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the laptop open long after Marcus's breathing had settled into the even rhythm of a man untroubled by what he'd built, and I read through 11 years of financial history until the shape of it finally resolved into something I could name. This wasn't a man who'd fallen for his assistant and let the affair bleed carelessly into the books. This was methodical. Vance Strategic Partners had been the first structure, small and testing, siphoning a manageable $11,000 a month for the better part of a year, enough to notice if you were looking, invisible if you weren't. Vance Strategic Partners 2 was something else entirely. $42,000, moved in a single transfer, timed to a trip that had never been booked, out of a fund earmarked for the firm's expansion into 2 new markets, the same expansion that had originally justified hiring Sydney at all. I understood, sitting there in the dark, that I was looking at an exit plan. Not a marriage quietly falling apart, a business being quietly hollowed out, one shell company at a time, by 2 people who had correctly calculated that the person most capable of noticing had been gently, gradually removed from the position that would have let her stop them. They had underestimated one thing. I still had my credentials, and I still remembered, better than either of them, exactly how the architecture worked. I called Priya the next morning, not a lawyer yet, but a forensic accountant I'd worked with years earlier, before Marcus decided the books were something I should stop enjoying. We met at a coffee shop across town, somewhere neither of us was likely to run into anyone from the firm. "Walk me through it slowly," Priya said, and I did, laying out the timeline on a napkin the way I used to lay out cash flow projections for investors, dates, amounts, entities, the quiet architecture of a betrayal, built to look like nothing at all. Priya went quiet for a long moment after I finished. "This isn't infidelity with financial fallout," she said finally. "This is embezzlement with an affair attached. If those transfers were made without proper authorization, and it doesn't sound like they were, you're not just a wronged wife, Renata. You're a co-owner whose asset base has been actively drained." I hadn't let myself use that word yet. Co-owner. Somewhere in the last 2 years of being gently, kindly eased out of the things I didn't need to worry about anymore, I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone with a legal claim to any of it. Priya's sentence landed like a hand on my shoulder, steadying something in me I hadn't realized had gone unsteady. "I need everything documented before I do anything else," I told her. "Bank records, the filings, the travel discrepancies, all of it, clean, dated, defensible." "How long do you need?" "However long it takes for them to get comfortable," I said. "People make mistakes when they think no one's watching." I spent the next 3 weeks becoming a kind of ghost in my own life, present at dinners, present at the firm's spring gala, present in every room Marcus expected me to occupy, while quietly building a file that grew heavier by the week. I photographed statements. I saved emails Marcus left open on the home computer, careless now, confident in a way he'd never been careless before. I tracked 4 more transfers into Vance Strategic Partners 2, totaling just under $200,000 in 6 weeks. And then, on a Thursday evening in April, I found the document that changed the shape of everything I'd been planning. It was buried in a folder on the shared drive Marcus assumed I no longer accessed, a draft partnership dissolution agreement, dated for the following month, transferring 60% of the firm's assets into a newly restructured entity. My name wasn't on it anywhere. Sydney's was. I read the document 3 times before I let myself fully absorb what it meant. It wasn't a divorce filing, though the effect would have been the same. It was a restructuring agreement, the kind of document lawyers draft when someone intends to walk away from a business relationship while keeping the business itself intact, just under a different name, with different owners of record. 60% of the firm's assets, its client contracts, its accounts, all of it slated to move into an entity called Cole Meridian Group, a name that used my surname, which struck me, in that moment, as either a strange act of arrogance or the laziest kind of cruelty. Sydney was listed as managing partner. I wasn't listed at all. The plan, as far as I could reconstruct it, was elegant in its cruelty. Marcus intended to dissolve our marriage and quietly dissolve my stake in the firm at the same time. Folding both losses into a single conversation, he probably imagined he could handle over one difficult dinner. By the time I understood what was happening, he expected, the assets would already have moved. I would be negotiating for scraps of a company that no longer legally resembled the one I'd spent 11 years building. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, the same kitchen where I'd first understood, months earlier, that something in my marriage had gone quietly wrong. I thought about all the dinners I'd sat through since then, smiling, asking about the Denver account, letting Sydney believe I was a woman too trusting to be dangerous. I called Priya first thing the next morning, and by that afternoon, I had also called Thomas Ferris, a business litigation attorney, a former colleague had recommended years earlier, and I had never once needed until now. "You have two things going for you," Thomas said, after reviewing everything Priya and I had compiled. "You're a documented co-owner with equal standing on every founding filing, which means any restructuring that excludes you needs your signature to be valid, meaning this document, as drafted, is legally worthless without you. And you have a clean, dated record of unauthorized transfers that, depending on how a prosecutor wanted to characterize it, could constitute embezzlement." "I don't want to destroy the firm," I said, surprising myself with how true it still felt. "I built too much of it to want to watch it burn." "Then we won't burn it," Thomas said. "We'll take it back." We spent the next 2 weeks preparing quietly, a formal notice of my ownership rights, a demand for full financial disclosure, documentation ready to hand to a prosecutor if it came to that, and a plan for exactly how and when I intended to make my move. I chose the firm's next partners meeting, the one where Marcus had scheduled the dissolution agreement for a preliminary vote among senior staff, unaware that the document required a signature he would never obtain. I walked in on a Tuesday morning in a navy suit I hadn't worn since I used to sit in on client pitches, back when Marcus still introduced me as his partner instead of his wife. Sydney was already at the head of the table, a folder in front of her, running through slides for a plan that existed, unbeknownst to her, entirely on paper I could invalidate with a single sentence. Marcus looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in months, I watched something close to real fear cross his face. "Renata," he said carefully, "I didn't realize you were joining us today." "I own 40% of this company," I said, taking the seat that had always technically been mine, setting my own folder down on the table with a quiet, deliberate weight. "I think it's past time I started joining every meeting again." Sydney's easy composure faltered for the first time since I'd known her. Marcus opened his mouth to say something and then, visibly, thought better of it. "Before we go any further with today's agenda," I said, opening my folder to the first page, "I'd like everyone in this room to see exactly what's been moving through Vance Strategic Partners for the past year." The room went silent in the particular way rooms do when everyone realizes, simultaneously, that the meeting they walked into is not the meeting they're going to leave. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid out the timeline the way I'd once laid out cash flow projections for nervous investors. Calm, precise, unhurried. The $11,000 monthly transfers. The shell entity's registration date. The $42,000 transfer timed to a Denver trip that had never been booked. And finally, the dissolution agreement itself, the one drafted to move 60% of the firm's assets into an entity bearing my own last name, without my knowledge or my signature. "This document," I said, sliding a copy down the table, "requires the consent of every founding partner to be valid. I am a founding partner. I was never consulted." Marcus's face had gone the color of old paper. Sydney's hand, resting on her own folder, had gone very still. "Renata, this isn't what it looks like," Marcus started, and I let him get exactly that far before I answered. "I know precisely what it looks like," I said. "I built the systems that let me see it clearly." That was, I think, the one detail neither of you accounted for. I watched the senior staff around the table exchange glances, the quiet, dawning recognition of people realizing they'd been asked to rubber stamp something built on a foundation that didn't exist. Nobody spoke in Marcus's defense. Nobody spoke in Sydney's either. "I'm not here to burn this firm down," I continued, closing my folder. 11 years of my work lives in these walls, And I don't intend to abandon it, because two people decided I was an inconvenience to plan around. I am here to inform you that as of this morning, my attorney has filed formal notice of my ownership rights, along with documentation of the unauthorized transfers, which will be forwarded to the appropriate parties if restitution isn't arranged within 30 days. Sydney left the firm within the week, quietly, without the severance package she'd apparently expected to negotiate on her way out. The restructuring agreement, unsigned and unsignable, was never filed. Vance Strategic Partners closed itself as quickly and quietly as it had opened, though not quietly enough to avoid the attention of the firm's outside auditors, who had questions of their own once I made sure they knew where to look. Marcus and I didn't stay married. That part, in the end, required no strategy at all, just a conversation neither of us particularly wanted to have, followed by paperwork that felt almost gentle compared to everything that had come before it. He kept his name on the firm's door. I kept my 40%, my board seat, and, for the first time in nearly 2 years, a seat at every table where decisions about my own future were actually made. I still walk past that firm sometimes, on my way to the consulting practice I started 6 months later, doing for other companies exactly what I once did quietly for my own. People ask me occasionally how I stayed so calm through all of it, how I sat across from him at dinner after dinner without ever letting my voice shake. I tell them the truth. I wasn't calm because I'd made peace with what was happening. I was calm because I already knew exactly how the story was going to end. If this kind of story pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed. There's more where this came from.